I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. South Africa is in the headlines for reasons its government certainly wishes were not gaining airtime, such as President Trump's baseless assertions about a white genocide. Yet, in a more positive vein, this month the country is hosting the G20 summit in Johannesburg. We are very fortunate to be joined for this episode by prominent analyst of South Africa, Dr. Terence McNamee. Terry published this month in the Christian Science Monitor a cover story entitled End of the Rainbow, a title that bluntly describes a country that Terry feels has dramatically lost its way. In this conversation, we look at what has gone wrong in the Rainbow Nation and also what gives him hope about a land and people with such potential. We are pleased to welcome Terry McNamee to Earlylands in Conversation. Well, Terry McNamee, or I should say Dr. Terence McNamee, thank you very much for joining us today. I presume you're in lovely Goli, the city of gold.
I am, Todd, yes.
You have just published an essay, End of the Rainbow, in the Christian Science Monitor's November 10th issue, which takes a pretty, I would say, harsh line on South Africa. It's a country I know that you love. You love it as much as I do, right? But I think some of these ideas have been percolating with you for a long time.
Yeah, they have, Todd. And I think, I'm a bit of a frustrated anthropologist. And this is very much about nations and stories. And all nations need them. And also, I think this is a really, really important time for South Africa because I can't imagine when it is going to be in the global spotlight again like this with the G20 summit coming up. So, South Africa had its time in the spotlight in terms of Ramaphosa's visit to Donald Trump in the Oval Office. But I think this one, this is a few days of very focused attention on South Africa. And I'm glad that the Christian Science Monitor, a publication I greatly respect, gave me an opportunity to do the cover story and really kind of remind people about this story, which many people around the world have forgotten about.
It's the South Africa story over the past, I guess 11 months has turned into a very strange one, right? Of Trump versus South Africa, white genocide, it's just not the story that needs to be discussed. But let's jump into it. So you open the story with the line, "Every nation needs a story." And South Africa's was one of the most inspiring in modern history. What made the Rainbow Nation myth so persuasive, and why did it matter beyond symbolism?
Well, I think if you remember back to the early 1990s, the first thing that had to be said is that most people and most experts were predicting that this is going to result in a fairly cataclysmic race war. The really, really informed people about South Africa thought that this coming together and reconciliation and the birth of a new democracy was quite improbable. And you can understand why they felt this way, because on the one side, you had a group of people. They built a society in their view. They controlled this society. They held all the levers of power.
Right, this being the white minority government. Right.
Yeah, the white minority. And, it was very much a racial oligarchy. So there's no way they are going to give this up except by force of arms. And then on the other side, you had the black majority, which had been treated in law, i.e. apartheid, as less than human by this regime for decades. And clearly they are going to seek some type of revenge or vengeance if given the opportunity. So these two forces were arrayed against each other. And, most people felt in their gut that there's no way they're going to be able to hammer out a negotiated settlement. And why it mattered beyond symbolism, and I think this is important, is that this was 1994. And there were many conflicts around the world where the sort of divides in society just seemed unbridgeable, whether that's Northern Ireland or the Middle East or elsewhere in the world.
Right. And the genocide in Rwanda happened the same month as the South African democratic elections and Bosnia.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important that you mention Rwanda because at the same time, this is such a tragic and harrowing sidebar to the South African story, is that in the weeks that we were celebrating the first democratic election, and then the election and inauguration of Nelson Mandela, which was the largest gathering of world leaders for 50 years, at this exact same time, the fastest genocide in human history was occurring a few hours to the north. So that's really important to sort of remember that. But I think South Africa, it provided a really inspiring story for all societies that are grappling with tensions and divisions.
The article and what you just said is a wonderful way to capture the magic of the 90s, right? The fact that path breaking leadership from the likes of Cyril Ramaphosa and Chris Hani and Rolf Mayer steered South Africa away from what many felt was this almost certain descent into widespread racial violence and civil war. However, you then very bluntly capture the current state of affairs when you note that, quote, South Africa is rudderless at home, according to an Ipsos What Worries the World study released in September of 25. 8 in 10 South Africans believe the country is headed in the wrong direction. Serious analysts have labeled South Africa a mafia state. Water and energy infrastructure in Johannesburg is crumbling. The city's politics have become farcical. 9 mayors in the past 6 years. Was there a particular moment when you felt the story stopped working and when the unifying narrative gave way to this deep cynicism and lack of hope?
Sadly, I can add one more data point to that list there is that Afrobarometer, which is, as you know, the quite
Right.
respected Pan African pollster, it just came out with a study, its first survey of South Africa since 2022. And it shows that support for military rule has increased to essentially half of those surveyed. So 50%
Wow.
of South Africans polled support military rule. So it's a very worrying situation. But in terms of, when did it stop working? It's hard to say. I mean, I write in the piece that it's sometime in the 2000s. Now, I don't necessarily blame Mbeki. He was quite focused, at least internationally, on the African Renaissance. And then at home, the country was really engulfed by, as you know, these two epidemics of one, crime, and two, AIDS. But I
Right.
don't think Mbeki really abandoned the story. I think what caused it to sort of fade from the sort of national imagination was this battle within the ANC, within his own party. And that was really about scheming for power and state resources, which again ultimately defeated him. And President Zuma became the president. And I think when he started on his essentially gouging the state and looting
Right.
it of its wealth and resources, the defenders of the sort of the story, the Rainbow Nation story, they kind of melted away. And I think in part they melted away because it felt a little bit abstract with the real problems of sort of fighting corruption and preventing South Africa's democracy from completely collapsing. And so it almost felt, I think the story felt like a bit of a luxury and
Sure.
even a distraction from these more sort of concrete kind of tasks that people had to be engaged in. And then as it happens with these things, you don't sort of notice when something, it just sort of disappears. And then you kind of wake up one day and you say, why does nobody talk about this story anymore? And I think that's sort of what happened in the 2000s going into the 2010s.
You use the phrase sort of battle for the soul of the ANC. And, this conversation that we're having now was being had 20 years ago. I'm thinking of William Gumede's book entitled The
Hmm.
Battle for the Soul of the ANC, which I think was that, 2005 or 2006.
Hmm.
So this is not an issue that's just come up over the past 2 or 3 years of the ANC eating itself alive. You write that many ANC leaders came to see the founding story of South Africa, the modern post or democratic South Africa, post apartheid, was not especially useful in their bid for power. And what happened to the moral imagination that once defied Mandela and Mbeki's generation as well?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think both Mbeki, let's say not Mbeki, but maybe Desmond Tutu is a better
Sure.
example. I think
Right.
in terms of him and Mandela, I mean, critically, they knew that all of a sudden South Africa did not become this perfect rainbow nation in 1994 when no one saw color anymore and everyone was equal.
Right.
They knew very, very well that the rainbow nation was a destination and like all societies, the new South Africa was going to be made and really become crystallized in the journey towards that destination. But what I think subsequent leaders did not do a very good job of is frankly taking care of that story. And so if you use the analogy or metaphor of a garden and imagine the founding story as a garden, you have to water that garden, you have to nurture it,
Sure.
you have to trim it, you have to pluck the weeds, or otherwise it's going to either wilt away and die, or, as may have happened, to sort of stretch the metaphor, it's going to grow really wild and become something of a jungle, like a Hobbesian sort of state of nature. And I think that's where we're at right now, with all of these kind of competing stories just sort of growing wild in the country.
That's an interesting way to put it. And Becky warned about two nations, one black and poor and one white and rich. Has that divide hardened into something truly permanent, or do you see ways that it could actually be bridged?
So I would say Mbeki was half right, in the sense that millions of Black South Africans have entered the middle class. And that's really, really important to emphasize. So if you go into any private schools in South Africa today,
Of
but
course.
particularly, say, in the province of Gauteng, they are unrecognizable compared to what they were 10 or 15 years ago. And I can say that from personal experience in terms of the school that my children go to. I mean, if you look at it in terms of student body, it's largely a Black school in
Right.
which Black parents are paying very hefty school fees for their kids to go there. And I think that is mirrored mostly across the country. So millions of Black people have entered the middle class. But where Mbeki is right is the face of poverty. So the tens of millions that are stuck at the bottom of the pyramid with little prospect of getting out of it, who are on social grants, highly disadvantaged, that is entirely Black. And I think that's the problem, is that the society has not done a good job, of lifting that, and making it, frankly, a more equal society, a society with more promise of progress.
Right.
And I think that's the big challenge, because, more and more people, it seems, are stuck in this situation of poverty and dependency. And that face is entirely Black.
You're saying, the private school, these very posh private schools that are now 50, 60, 70% non-white,
Hmm.
of course, that's a wonderful metric. But at the same time, you then go look at a township like Deep Sloot in northern Johannesburg.
Hmm.
I'm thinking about Anton Harber's wonderful book
Yeah.
10, 12 years ago, right, about Deep Sloot. I don't even know, it's now what, probably 750,000 people. And, I remember
Mm.
driving by it in 2003 and four, and it was maybe 100,000 people. So at the same time,
Well,
the
yeah.
growth in the population, the growth
Mhm.
in the chronically poor is hugely concerning.
Yeah, it is. I would just add one thing, though, excuse me, to what you said, Todd. You're absolutely right in terms of, I mean, let's call it for your listeners what it is. It's slumification, right?
Right. Right.
And the expansion of, which were once known as sort of shanty towns, which are now known as informal settlements, is hugely alarming. So in Johannesburg, in this city alone, there's over 500,000 people that frankly live in tin shacks.
Right.
But the one sort of nuance I would add to what you're saying is, I can't give you any numbers, but very significant proportions of those informal settlements are Blacks from elsewhere in Africa, right? They are migrant populations. I've heard numbers of
Malawians or
Ye
Congolese or
absolutely. So and I couldn't give you numbers, and I don't think the South African government could either,
right.
but, maybe the mobile phone companies could. But it's very, very significant numbers of
Right.
non-South Africans who are in those, settlements.
Well, and that tells you, something about state of sort of governance and economic development on the continent that, South Africa still, has had what, 1 or 2%, if they're lucky, growth over the past
Mhm.
10, 12 years, but it yet is still that beacon of opportunity for other Africans to see their chance to migrate to South Africa, because there's more opportunity there than there is in Malawi or in DRC. Um,
Yeah, that's true.
you note that, quote, if you don't tell your own story, someone else will. And we're now seeing rival narratives, Afrikaner self-determination, populist nationalism, racial grievance. What do these competing myths tell us about how deeply the national idea of South Africa has fractured? Or how much of it is media hype and how much of it is a reality? There is no rainbow nation.
Well, certainly, if you think about it in terms of sort of social capital, social cohesion, I mean, South Africa is definitely in trouble. And nature abhors a vacuum, and
Of
into
course.
this vacuum, in the absence of the sort of rainbow nation story, we see all of these other competing stories that have rushed in. And I think maybe just to talk for a little bit about the sort of Afrikaner self determination story. I mean, this is fairly extraordinary in the sense that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, this would have had no traction whatsoever because, of course, Afrikaners are the community that is most and
Right.
rightly associated with the establishment of apartheid. But when you hear them today, and leaving aside the sort of completely whitewashing the apartheid era, and I must emphasize, I'm talking about a significant and outspoken minority of Afrikaners, not the entire population. But this minority, they talk about history in terms of nearly 4 centuries at the tip of Africa. And, leaving aside not to be flippant, but leaving aside apartheid, it's a pretty compelling story of sacrifice and resilience and achievement. And they have many eloquent spokespersons, that are lobbying on their behalf in places like Washington, D.C., of course. Their story about how they, develop their culture and their language, their education and their economy, it's landing pretty well. So they have this kind of alternative national story.
Right.
What they don't have, and maybe this is a sort of small mercy, is other than Oranje, which of course is this tiny little speck of land in the Free State province of South Africa,
I
which
think it may be
is
Northern Cape because I have been there.
I
Actually, I think
think
it's
you're
tech.
absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. Somewhere in those
Yeah.
somewhere in those
So,
borderlands.
yes, it
We
is
know
not
it's a
the most populated area, I would say.
yeah, I think you're right. It's somewhere near the Orange River. And but other than that, self-determination is quite difficult when you don't have territory, right?
Sure. Sure.
And I think that is something. But as I make the point in the piece somewhat provocatively, I think in their minds, when they're making these huge new investments in Afrikaans speaking university, when they're making these huge investments in terms of lobbying overseas, when they're talking about freedom, when
Right.
they are trying to relitigate, the 1994 agreement, to some extent, it feels like they're kind of trying to build a parallel country within
Hmm.
South Africa. And I think it reinforces the idea that this minority never bought into the sort of non-racial vision of 1994.
Who would have thought that a sort of Afrikaner nationalism would now feature in foreign affairs? But it certainly does. Let's talk about South Africa's foreign policy, which you describe as hobbled by contradictions, claiming constitutional liberalism at home while cozying up to autocrats abroad. Is that hypocrisy simply the behavior of a middle power trying to survive in a very fractured world order? Or, how do you think, about the rest of the continent's very uneasy relationship with South Africa's claim to continental leadership, right? It's something that's very
Mm.
unpopular if you would ask Nigerians or you'd ask Kenyans or Ethiopians. Tell us how to think about South Africa's this almost schizophrenic foreign policy.
I think I should firstly recommend the Peace and Foreign Affairs by one of your previous guests on this podcast, Michelle Gavin, who wrote an
Indeed.
excellent article that framing sort of South Africa's foreign policy and its relationship with the United States. And she makes the point in that piece, which I agree with entirely, is that, of course, all foreign policies are, riddled with hypocrisy. So
Right.
South Africa is not unique in that respect. But where I think it draws kind of unflattering attention to itself is that its constitution is really supposed to be not kind of like the yearn for idealized aspiration for the country, but it's also very much supposed to shape its foreign policy. And much of South Africa's foreign policy completely flies in the face of its own, frankly,
Right.
very liberal, mostly very liberal constitution. And so that's a problem. And I think the reality is that in terms of this generation of ANC leaders, and I think it's important to emphasize that the ANC still controls foreign policy in the South African government of national unity. for this generation, I think the liberation struggle, that's really still the lens through which these officials sort of see the world. But again, yes, hobbled by contradictions. But in terms of the rest of Africa, there's no doubt that a certain kind of, just like there's American exceptionalism, there's a certain South African exceptionalism within the
Indeed.
African continent, which was
Right.
born of their sort of their economic might and also their transition story. And then, of course, they had Mandela for 5 years in power, and he was by some margin probably the most respected world leader at the time. And so it had this sort of sense of being a natural leader on the continent. But I don't think it's done a very good job, frankly, in terms of playing that continental hegemon. I don't think it's done a good job because partly because of turmoil at home. Like
Right.
you can't be an economic basket case and a governance basket case at home whilst projecting authority abroad. It's very difficult to do that. And I think in terms of the African continent, in terms of South Africa's diplomacy, it also hasn't been very clever. It hasn't been very deft.
No,
Often it's
not at
been a
all.
kind of bullying behavior. And it hasn't, and frankly, it also hasn't done a very good job within its region in the sense that, of course, it's overwhelmingly powerful if you compare it to its comparatively small neighbors. But has it done a good job in terms of lifting the whole region as, in the sense, I mean, this is probably a poor comparison, but in terms of you think about major powers like Germany and Europe, and their sort of success cannot be in isolation. It's about lifting the economies around them up. And I don't think South Africa has done a very good job in that respect.
Well, the brand South Africa has certainly suffered on the continent by xenophobia, which is rampant in South Africa. I
Mhm.
mean, I'm thinking back to my time working there during one of the spates of xenophobic riots, and we were trying to bring some of our younger staff down to South Africa from Nigeria for a training program, and we had a number of our Nigerian employees who were saying, "I don't want to go to South Africa. I don't feel safe there as a Nigerian because I know how South Africans view Nigerians." That just was one small vignette, but just highlights that brand South Africa is pretty tarnished on the continent, driven in particular by this virulent strain of xenophobia, right?
Absolutely. It certainly has not gone away. And again, I don't want to sort of paint the sort of South African character as kind of inherently Afrophobic or xenophobic, because there's a lot of factors that
Sure, sure.
can result in unrest and violence in townships. And the government has also played its role by effectively losing control of the country's borders and frankly allowing large numbers of migrants to South Africa to work and to live here without any sort of accountability in terms of proper documentation. So that's a real issue. But I think you're absolutely right in the sense that South Africa can claim all it wants about Ubuntu foreign policy and this kind of stuff, but it's very far removed from the lived reality of migrants within South Africa who face very, very challenging circumstances throughout the country. And it has to be emphasized, in particular, migrants from elsewhere in Africa.
You quote in the article Kaleem Rajab saying that South Africans excel at tenacity, but it's hardly a long-term strategy. And how do you see that trait? Is tenacity a virtue or just a symbol of national exhaustion? I'm thinking of Joburg, for example, a city I deeply love and consider in many respects sort of a second home. But it's hard to argue against the sentiment that the city is crumbling and almost comically misgoverned. Yet Joburg survives as a financial hub, remains vibrant and full of life. Is that the tenacity you mentioned? To tell us how to think about that.
Yeah, so I mean, Africa well, Todd, and certainly that kind of resilience or tenacity that Kaleem refers to is certainly not unique to South Africa. I mean, if you
Of
look at
course.
countries like Nigeria and you look at resilience, and you can't imagine how some of these countries actually hold together with the extraordinary pressures that are exerted on communities, and yet they do. So I think, tenacity is a trait that can be found in many places. But in the case of Johannesburg, we are in, I think, a pretty existential crisis in the sense that, yes, we identify all of these problems. And, 12 years ago, I wrote an article with an intern of mine at the time who was from Detroit, Michigan. And we were writing about whether the fate of Detroit, which at the time filed the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S.
Right.
history, could that happen to Joburg? And we've suggested, yes, it could. And frankly, it has, and even worse. And I don't see Johannesburg recovering in the same way that Detroit is recovering. And there's many factors around that. I mean, Johannesburg has been sort of used as almost a kind of political football in this the politics between the ANC and elsewhere. But I think the real sign is that yes, it's still the financial hub, but I look at it from simply a bricks and mortar perspective. If you look at property prices in Johannesburg, we're in this, fundamental long-term pit of despair. And, people are, putting their mouth and sorry, their money in terms of the future. And, people are just not making big bets on
Wow.
Johannesburg in terms of establishing their lives and their futures here. And that's reflected in the fact that elsewhere, such as in Cape Town, which is this
Right.
kind of oasis of sort of soaring property prices, in Johannesburg, they're effectively dead and massively declined if you look at elsewhere in the world. And so that, I think, is probably the most sober reflection of people's weariness about the future of this
Right.
of the city. I could give you just unbelievable data points on the state of sort of misrule and the problems with particularly water infrastructure. So there
Right.
has to be some seriously root and branch, deep reform, which is going to result in a few years of pain before things get better.
Let's shift a little bit. I think you can't have a conversation about the state of South Africa without somehow bringing sport into it, which you
Mhm.
do very well because it is a probably the most sport mad nation in the world. I'm sure Australia and elsewhere would argue with that, but you discuss in your piece Sia Kolisi and the Springboks, South Africa's national rugby side, come across in your piece almost as mythic figures, reminders of what
Yeah.
unity used to look like. And why do you think, particularly in the South African context, why do symbols like sport succeed where politics so clearly fails?
Well, thanks, Todd. But I have to first say that as a Canadian, I'm still in trauma and mourning about
Yes.
About the Blue Jays, and I think
7
actually
games, my friend, 7 very, very, memorable games.
I'm not sure that this one is recoverable, but yeah, it really hurts. And so yes, South Africa is a sports mad nation, but I think it's really important to focus on the Springboks, and I'll explain why. There's almost no other institution within South Africa that was more vulnerable to being consumed by the politics of this nation than the Springboks, because they were an absolute icon
Of
of
course.
sort of white supremacy and brutality during apartheid. But not only that, internationally, they were such a powerful symbol of the apartheid regime. And as you will know, part of the international sort of turn against the apartheid regime related to protests around the Springboks traveling
Right.
around the world, and particularly their tour to the United Kingdom, when people like Lord Hayne and others use those opportunities of the Springbok games to show what a barbarous system South Africa was then ruled by. And then, of course, the Springboks are so caught up in the racial politics of South Africa in terms of what you would call affirmative action and
Right.
in terms of the balance between affirmative action and merit and so forth. So there was every opportunity for the Springboks to just be totally consumed by the politics. But it not only hasn't been consumed by them, it has transcended them in a way where some would make the argument that it's not just the most famous sort of sporting team, it's perhaps the best run institution
Right.
in the
Right.
country, in the sense that its composition is very representative of the country, and yet it's also fundamentally a merit-based organization where
Right.
the best players in South Africa are on that team. And then, of course, obviously everyone loves winners. And the South Africans are the 2 times reigning world champions. And on their current performance, one wouldn't bet against them winning for the 3rd time. And I think whereas so many of the other symbols have kind of melted away, the Springboks are the most almost visceral sign of the Rainbow Nation ideal. And as I write in the piece, they're not just a reference point for the country's Battle Angels. I mean, an argument can be made that they are the reference point. I mean,
Right.
other than the
Right.
flag, other than the national anthem, there's not many symbols that have that kind of evocative power to show what is possible. And again, people may poo-poo it because it's sports and that kind of stuff. But let me tell you, to navigate the politics of the country and the way that institution has, given how passionate people are about that sport. It really is a remarkable achievement. And it's also the source of very serious analysis and even scholarly analysis about how that institution and how the Springboks have done that. So they really are a quite an extraordinarily potent symbol of what's possible, or maybe what has been achieved.
How many global sports stories outside the United States would draw an American movie audience to Invictus, right? I mean,
Mhm.
the
Well,
fact
so
that that was
Todd,
such a
so that's a
success,
great
right?
let's actually bring that up because I think that's an important point. And let's break down the numbers. So on that team in 1995, there was one black player, Chester Williams. He was the
Right.
one black player on that entire rugby team, and a lot of people sort of dismissed it as it was important, but as a kind of tokenization. There is no token players on the Springboks today. And if you look at that team, the way they draw from the black community, the colored community, the white community, there's nothing token about anyone. They are just all at the absolute top of their game. So that's
Ab-
a kind of reflection of the evolution over 30 years from the Invictus and the Springboks team that won in 1995 to what they are today.
That's spot on. Let's shift a little bit to well, we've talked all about the future here, but what, efforts that are actually being made to steer this ship away from the rocks. Cyril Ramaphosa, President Ramaphosa's national dialogue was meant to reset South Africa. Instead, you write that the national dialogue exposed its broken heart. What would a genuine national dialogue need to look like to actually mean something? And do you think it's actually possible to convene such a gathering?
Yeah, I think it is possible. But what's interesting about that question, Todd, is that when I was writing the story for the Christian Science Monitor, I'd written that South Africans tend to excel at talk shops, right? And
Oh,
I think
yes.
I've lived here too long in the sense that I thought that was a commonly used term, talk shops. And he asked me,
Oh, yeah.
clarify, what's a talk shop? I said, so
Interesting.
South Africans are excellent in many ways about being very transparent about the challenges in the country and frankly the need to work together for solutions. The problem is that in many ways it's become analysis paralysis. There are so many commissions out there, so many
Right.
reports, so many papers, and I think what's lacking is the kind of action on the ground, at least a sustained action. And I think that's what's critical. So I would never poo-poo those who are trying to engage and convene dialogues because we always need to talk to each other. But I think to some extent in South Africa that they've people have talked enough. I mean, people kind of know what to do,
Right.
and it's
Right.
really about putting that action and into work. And maybe it's not a coincidence that one of the opposition parties has called itself Action SA in the sense that this is what's really required. I mean, we don't need another commission, and these are wrenching events. We're going through one right now in South Africa that is exposing the sort of rot in the police service and in
Of
terms of
course.
the justice
Yes.
system. And so this transparency is really incredible. And hopefully it all congeals and comes together and action can follow, but it hasn't to a large degree in the last 10 or 15 years.
What keeps you connected to the place emotionally and intellectually, despite a clear frustration that you have?
Well, I mean, in terms of just in a practical sense, there's a tremendous amount of talent that is still in the country. South Africans have been very good at at building all of those kind of parts of the state that are important in terms of financial services, all kinds of things it can do at the top level. It can build the best schools. It
Right.
can build sort of the best hospitals. So, for instance, if you want medical care, I mean, I would put South Africa, if you pay for it, right at the top in terms of globally. And you know
Right.
this from your time here, in terms of if you want to see a specialist in this or that, you want to be in South Africa. And similarly, in terms of the quality of education at the top level, you may pay for it, but you're not going to get that level. You're not going to get that much bang for your buck anywhere else in the world. The problem, of course, is how do you then distribute that excellence across society and make it available to the majority and not just the sort of wealthy elite as it is now. And that's the huge challenge. But certainly the ability and the skills are here. It's just how can that translate into increasing, the size of the pie for everyone.
Right. Final question, my friend, and we always ask this, and one that I think is probably very hard to answer because the options to this are so limitless.
Mm.
But give us 1 to 2 books that you would recommend to someone who wants to understand more about this truly wonderful yet deeply troubled country. What would fiction, nonfiction, and
Mm.
again, my shelves behind me are groaning here with books about South Africa. But if you're on that desert island and you can only
Yeah.
take a couple books with you,
Ugh.
what would they be?
Maybe I'll give you an answer that might surprise you, but I think the two that I would suggest, the first one would be My Traitor's Heart
Of
by
course.
Rian Malan. It's a book
Great
that
book.
came out in 1990, and it's a nonfiction and an extraordinary story that has universal application in terms of a young Afrikaner who was very liberal in his disposition. And if you read the book, you get such an extraordinarily harrowing picture of what apartheid was like viewed from his lens. He was someone who engaged a lot with Black communities across the color
Right.
barrier, which was not that common. But it's his own grappling with his own identity. And he was, as you know, related to the first
DF
first
DF
apartheid
Milan.
prime
I think it's
minister of South Africa.
grandson or something. DF Milan's
Yeah, yeah,
grandson, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And his grappling with his questions of identity has a kind of universal application. But I think if you want to know just how perilous a situation South Africa was in 1990 and what an extraordinary achievement it was to transition out of that, read My Traitor's Heart by Rian Milan. And maybe
Awesome.
the
We'll
next one.
put that in the show notes for sure. Yes. What's your
Yeah,
second?
I think, and I think that maybe the next one, interestingly enough, would maybe be Trevor Noah's "Born a Crime." I would highlight that what's interesting about Trevor Noah is that he was born in 1984, and so he kind of talks a lot about growing up in apartheid and that type of stuff. That's not really true in the sense that he was still a very young man. I mean, he would have been only 6 years of age when Mandela came out of prison. But
Right.
the reason why that book I think is so important is that in many ways it's kind of a container of hope and promise for the country, because Trevor Noah is such a child of sort of post-apartheid South Africa in terms of his extraordinary sort of sense of humor, his
Right.
perspective on life. I mean, he's an absolute peerless talent in so many ways. And so I think if the post-apartheid South Africa, the new South Africa, was to look towards a kind of one of their own, but a bit of a hero, a bit of an icon, a symbol of what country can achieve. I think Trevor Noah is probably as good as anyone. And his perspective on things, if you really want to get a glimpse of the South African sense of humor and how the place ticks, I think read his book. So I would probably say, yeah, Born a Crime and My Traitor's Heart.
Yeah. We will put those into the show notes. Terry, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I can't recommend more highly your essay, End of the Rainbow, which appears in the Christian Science Monitor's 10th November issue. Very much worth your time. Terry, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Todd.